Good evening. Welcome to the 11th edition of the Political Mic. This evening, I'm going to have with me joining Professor W. Sherman Rogers. Professor Rogers, it's a privilege and honor to have you with me tonight. We're going to go ahead and give your introduction right now. Professor W. Sherman Rogers is an attorney and a tenured professor of law at Howard University School of Law. He's also a registered stockbroker, general securities principal, and has life and health insurance licenses. During his career, Professor Rogers has taught at 6 law schools: Miles College Law School, Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University, Howard University School of Law, Brigham Young University School of Law, the UDC David A. Clark School of Law, and the University of Baltimore School of Law. Professor Rogers has taught a number of courses during his career in legal education. They include corporations, securities, regulation, agency, partnerships, and other unincorporated business organizations, property, federal courts, conflict of laws, entrepreneurship law and policy, remedies, Title VII, litigation, civil procedure, and law, economics, and capitalism, the course I'm currently in with him now. So it's fair to say Professor Rogers has a full plate. Prior to becoming a law professor, Professor Rogers practiced law in both the private and government sectors. During this time period, Professor Rogers, among other things, argued appellate cases for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission between 1979 and 1983 in the various United States Circuit Courts of Appeals. Some of the cases that Professor Rogers argued during that time include the EEOC versus Liggett and Myers Incorporated, Brown versus AG Gerard Manufacturing Company, EEOC versus Zippo Manufacturing Company. Professor Rogers has also written several petitions for certiorari to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of various law firms. The subject matter of those petitions include the following: the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, the Federal Securities Fraud under the 1933 Securities Act and the 1934 Securities and Exchange Act, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, and much more, including the 14th Amendment due process requirements and attorney disciplinary proceedings to determine whether an attorney should be disbarred. Professor Rogers, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and just open up the floor with the topic for tonight. We're dealing particularly with the economy. Such an honor. You've written many books, one of which is Winners and Losers in the American Capitalistic Economy, a premiere. You've also written the book that I want to discuss tonight, which is The African American Entrepreneur: Challenges and Opportunities in the Trump Era. Professor Rogers, there's a presidential debate, the first presidential debate of the general election 2020 cycle that will be happening tomorrow evening. And before COVID-19, Trump and the Trump campaign kept touting his record on the economy. And one of the target audiences that he had crafted this message for was particularly African Americans. I believe under Brad Parscale's leadership, the campaign has sought to pull the support of at least 15% of African American men. This is a very interesting tactic for him, and we saw it evident in the Republican National Convention, in which we saw many representatives in the world of sports, as well as in politics, voice their concern and opinion as to why African Americans need to have an open mind for President Trump and his policies. The unemployment rate for African Americans that was, as we kept hearing, was very low under President Trump. This is, of course, before COVID-19. I want to get your response to this assertion, and get your take on whether President Donald Trump's policies have benefited African Americans. The floor is yours. Go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor. Well, the truth of the matter is that the so-called Trump economy was built on Obama's, and of course, it is now in shambles. The United States experienced, Michael, some of its best years of job gains in 2014 and 2015, in Obama's second term, when the economy added more than 225,000 jobs a month. Uh, at the highest level of job gains under the Trump administration, which peaked at around 193,000 new jobs a month in 2018, seems to me that that should be enough to end the conversation. In other words, the Trump economy at its highest point in 2018 was adding no more than 193,000 jobs to the economy, whereas in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, the average was 225,000 jobs per year. In fact, let's talk about economic growth. Excluding 2020, growth in Trump's year, through his 3 years of his administration, was approximately 2.5%. And this is like barely over Obama's 5 years. And so I don't see where all of this credit that Trump is getting is coming from. I can continue on. Economists generally credit Obama with getting the recovery after the Great Recession solidly underway, and Trump gets a little credit for keeping it going. But it's kind of hard to disassociate Trump with what we're experiencing now with this coronavirus pandemic, which has devastated our economy. And I do not want to blame Trump for the over 200,000 deaths that we have experienced in this country. But probably a lot of lives could have been saved if we had a different leader. Well, let's look at his claim with respect to Black unemployment. As I mentioned to you, Trump has claimed that he's been the best president for Black people since Abraham Lincoln. That got him a whopping 4 Pinocchios by Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post. Now, the truth of the matter is that when Trump took office, Black unemployment was really at historic lows. And it did go down a couple of notches, but that had nothing to do with Trump. That had everything to do with the fact that as everything improves for America generally, Black people get some benefit from that. But if you look at the historic numbers, African Americans have always experienced twice the rate of unemployment or more in this economy, substantially lower personal and family income. Blacks are 3 times more likely to live in poverty, Michael, and possess 1/5 of the net worth of whites. Those numbers just have held up time and time again. Trump hasn't done anything to improve those numbers. Well, let's look at what happened last month in August. The U.S. economy added 1.4 million jobs in August. But 1/4 of those jobs were for temporary workers that are soon to end. So what did the unemployment rate look like for Black people? It was 13% compared to 7.3% for whites. That is in keeping with the historical averages that Black people have twice the amount of unemployment than do white people. And so Trump hasn't done anything to change those historic numbers. Now, if you really want to understand Donald Trump from a political standpoint of view, or any president, all you have to do is to look at their annual budget proposals. The budget proposals are supposed to come out February of each year. And as you probably already know, Michael, the fiscal year for the federal government begins on October 1st of every year. And so every February, a U.S. president will will submit a budget proposal to Congress, and this gives you some idea of the mindset of a particular president. Let me just, if you can indulge me, just spend about 60 seconds talking about Trump's budget proposal unveiled on February 10 of this year. It called for removing $500 billion in funding from the Medicare program over the next 10 years, including $135 billion from the Medicare prescription drug program and tens of billions from Social Security. Trump's budget proposal requested a $920 billion cut to Medicaid. It asked for an $844 billion cut to Obamacare. Now let's just refresh your memory. One of Trump's goals all along has been to do away with Obamacare, which is technically called the Affordable Care Act, with no replacement. So this is giving you some insights into the mindset of President Trump. He proposed to add another $3.4 trillion to the federal debt by 2024 on top of the $3 trillion the president has added in just the 3 years that he's been in office by piling on $1 trillion a year in budget deficits during a peacetime expansion of the economy. And so the budget has gone completely out of whack. The deficit has increased to historic proportions since Trump has been president. Do you have any other questions that you want to ask? Because I have at least 16 metrics by which to govern Trump's performance since he's been president. But I think you were more interested initially in his performance with respect to jobs. No, his performance has been built totally on Obama's, and it really hasn't improved it. If anything, it's made some things much worse.
And as we're discussing, the economic policies of both this administration and the previous administration, and how those policies have translated into unemployment rates and tangible statistics that we can point to see the records of both the policies of the current administration and the past administration. What really separates the wheat from the tares is the economy in terms of where people stand politically. And those who are more liberal tend to believe in more government intervention. They believe in more government-funded programs to help those who are impoverished and the most vulnerable in society. Those on the conservative end tend to believe that the government needs to be less involved, and they tend to encourage more of independent entrepreneurship and charity to help address the plight of those who are not doing so well in society. In your book, Winners and Losers, you had pointed out that one of the Koch brothers, Charles G. Koch, specifically agreed with Bernie Sanders' assessment of the two different economic ideologies. Bernie Sanders, of course, who proudly embraced the term socialist, which was, at the time and still is, political novelty. But specifically, Koch stated that, number one, America's political and economic system is often rigged to help the privileged few at the expense of everyone else, particularly the least advantaged. Two, America has become a two-tiered society, particularly one that increasingly dooms millions of citizens to live to lives of poverty and hopelessness. And three, many corporations seek and benefit from corporate welfare while ordinary citizens are denied opportunities at a level playing field. I want to bring our attention to tax policy a little bit, specifically the Trump tax cut, which has been the largest tax cut since World War II. Now, it's typical for a Republican president. We saw it with George W. Bush in the early 2000s. One of the very first things he did was go ahead and sign a new tax cut. This was after the booming Clinton economy. Remember, Clinton was the first president, I think, since Andy Jackson, to balance the budget. Robert Johnson, you mentioned in chapter 9 of your book, The African American Entrepreneur, Challenges and Opportunities in the Trump Era. You mentioned that Robert Johnson actually says that Trump's tax cuts benefit the African American community. Specifically, he said that the unemployment rate among Black workers was at the lowest level since the Labor Department began tracking data in 1972. He praised the current U.S. business environment when taking into account the Trump tax cuts of December 2017, and he generally expressed optimism about how Black Americans would continue to fare economically. So, Professor, my question is: are the pre-COVID-19 job rate numbers attributable to President Trump's tax cut? Are the economy that was doing so well, as we often heard, is that the result of the trickle down ideology of Trump's tax cut? And go ahead and unmute yourself.
Nobel laureate Paul Krugman believes that supply side economics, which is pejoratively referred to as trickle down economics, is one of the biggest ever lies told on to the American people. It's just never worked. He calls this the ultimate zombie idea in his book about zombie economics. In fact, I suggest that everybody consider purchasing not only my books, but Paul's book, which is called Arguing with Zombies. What is a zombie idea? It's just an idea that has been completely refuted by studies time and time again. An idea that has never once been proved to be true. In fact, as I mentioned in the second chapter of Winners and Losers, Michael, even Pope Francis weighed in on this and said, the poor are still waiting for all of these benefits to trickle down. He says, but in the meantime, the poor and the helpless are still waiting. Everybody knows it's a bogus idea. So it's just amazing that it's been able to be kept alive so long. So what is exactly supply side economics? It posits that if the government reduces taxes, eliminates burdensome regulations on individuals and businesses, that individuals and firms will have this incentive to just go hog wild and to become so productive, and that they will become so productive that even though there is a diminished tax revenue, that the extra production that will be caused as a result of these reduced taxes will pay off the tax cut losses of revenue by themselves. It just never has happened. In all the studies that have ever been done, perhaps the only amount that has recovered from the trillions of dollars that have been lost in revenue, for example, that's what's being lost by the 2017 tax cut. It may replace anywhere at the highest level, maybe 15% of the lost revenues, which means that the other 85% of lost revenues is just still there. And so let's take a look at what the actual effect, Michael, of the Trump tax cuts on America. As of March 2019, it has become clear that the GOP tax cut law has not led to the huge tax revenue that President Trump, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and many Republican lawmakers promised would eventually occur. So let's look at some statistics as of March 2019, and they've just gotten worse, Michael. In February 2019, the US government posted the largest monthly budget deficit in American history. Now, this is because of this so-called Great Trump tax cut. That monthly budget deficit was $234 billion. It's because we have no revenues coming in as we once did. Listen to this particular stat. In the first 5 months of the federal government's 2019 fiscal year, which is from October 2018 to September 30th, 2019, the government spent $544 billion more than what it received in income taxes. How long can we go on with that? I mean, that's not a good thing, okay? Trump's own budget issued on March 11, 2019, projected the U.S. public debt would hit 22.8 trillion by 2025. Well, we're almost there now, more than 50% higher than he went when he took office. So Trump has increased, the debt by more than 50% from the time that he's come in office. That's going to happen by the next few years. On January 28th, 2019, the Congressional Budget Office issued a report that projected the economy to grow by only 1.7% in 2020. But we don't even have to go there now. But because of Trump's mishandling of the coronavirus epidemic, we are now officially in one of the worst recessions that the country has ever been in. I would like to for you to consider Kansas's experiment with the supply side economics. So there was this, Kansas is a very deeply red state. Dinah Sykes, a Republican member of the Kansas Senate, discussed the disaster that state experienced after 5 years of a revolutionary tax overhaul that promised to be a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the Kansas economy. These promises were based on the notion, Michael, of supply side economics. The Kansas experiment began in 2012 and mercifully ended in 2017. Now, this is a Republican senator who voted for all of these drastic budget cuts and reduction in taxes. This is what Dinah Sykes had to say about the result of this drastic experiment with supply side economics. Roughly 3,000 state employee positions were cut, salaries were frozen, and road projects canceled. We delayed payments to the state employee retirement system and emptied our savings account. Even as we issued more than $2 billion in new bonds to float our debt, Kansas received 3 credit downgrades, making that debt costlier. In 2012, traditional budget forecast models accurately predicted the devastating effect the tax breaks would have on state revenue. Proponents of the plan used dynamic scoring, predicting incredible economic growth, like Trump did with respect to the 2017 tax cuts, supporting their own preconceived ideas. I might add, Michael, zombie ideas. Today, we know which forecasts were correct. Now, check this out, Michael, before you start asking me any more questions. Across the state of Kansas, citizens may have been paying less in income taxes, but those decreases were offset by increases in sales taxes, property taxes, and fees, highly regressive forms of taxation. These changes alone were not enough to put the state on the right path. Education and infrastructure, key investments necessary for strong economic growth, were treated as the enemy. As we went through our 2017 legislative session, the shot of economic adrenaline still showed no signs of materializing. Just like Pope Francis said, we're still waiting for the trickle down. Our state functioned as though the Great Recession had never ended. Senator Sykes concluded her article in the Washington Post by noting that Kansas should serve as a cautionary tale as Republicans in Congress begin working to modify the federal code. Clearly, they didn't listen. That's why we are where we are now. Trickle down doesn't work. It never has worked. It's the ultimate zombie argument based upon zombie ideas, zombie economics, It just simply doesn't work, has never worked, and now we're stuck with it.
I'm glad that you brought up the federal deficit, Professor, because in this election, it seems like the federal debt is not getting a lot of attention. In 2012, it did. I remember in the Republican convention, there was a big, dramatic countdown or debt watch clock that Governor Mitt Romney often, pointed to as a candidate against as a challenger against incumbent President Barack Obama. But I want to turn attention to, further into the federal deficit, specifically looking at apolitical sources of information. These are not sources that have a political skew one way or the other. These are just the facts as they are. During the 1980s, President Reagan increased the debt, and this is according to balance.com, a website that's dedicated to tracking the federal debt. President Reagan increased the debt by 186%. Reagan added $1.86 trillion to the national debt. Reagan's brand of supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics, or as his own vice president said in the debates with him in 1980, voodoo economics. Those economics didn't grow the economy enough to offset the lost revenue from its tax cuts, as you alluded to, Professor. Reagan also increased the debt, but the defense budget. He increased the defense budget by 35%. President George W. Bush added $5.849 trillion dollars to the national deficit. This is the second largest dollar amount to the national deficit that has been added. And this was a 101% increase, the fourth largest percentage increase. Bush's war on terrorism in response to 9/11, which resulted in, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, also added to that amount. The war in Afghanistan specifically, 1.1 trillion. The war in Iraq, $1 trillion. Military spending rose to a record level of $800 billion a year during the Bush administration. But we also have to look, being that we're getting a bipartisan perspective, a nonpartisan perspective at this. We have to look at President Obama's record. President Obama had increased the national debt significantly as well. He added $588 trillion to the national debt. This 74% increase was the fifth largest increase to the national debt. Obama, we know, as you mentioned, fought off the Great Recession. He took office in 2009. The country was in bad economic shape, and so there was need for government intervention and drastic measures at that time. So though he fought off the Great Recession with $831 billion in economic stimulus package spending, the Obama tax cuts added $858 billion to the debt. And his sponsored signature bill, the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act, also known as Obamacare, that was designed to reduce the debt by $143 billion in 10 years' time, had also added to the debt. So, Professor, with these numbers in mind, folks on both sides point fingers at the others. And of course, one side has a better record than the other in terms of getting us closer to, or in a better position than we were before to, in terms of our national debt. How do you see Trump squaring off in respect to his predecessors concerning the national debt? Specifically, as we're in this election campaign and a lot of focus is on the pandemic, there's much more of a need now, it seems, than in the Great Recession period, like you mentioned, for government to issue out more economic stimulus package spending bills. We know that the Senate failed about 2 weeks ago to come up with a bipartisan agreement. The House Democrats had passed a bill that called for $3 trillion in spending, and the Republican Senate did not want to agree to anything above 1.5 trillion, I believe. And so that resulted in a stalemate that was not productive. Do you see us going further into debt under Trump's watch based on his record? And do you have hope for a potential Biden administration as it relates to the federal debt? You're on mute. I'm sorry.
I've got it. So necessarily the deficit is going to dramatically increase under Trump, especially with the way he slashed taxes. Here's a little known fact. After World War II, it was not unusual for the highest progressive tax rate on incomes to be 90%. People don't believe it, but it's true. You can just go back to 1945. In fact, during the greatest period of growth in American history, in the aftermath of World War II and going forward, tax rates of 90%, 77%. People don't believe it, but it's true. That's the reason why when Bernie Sanders and others talk about taxing the very wealthy, it's like nothing really new. It wasn't until Nixon and Reagan that all this, let's lower taxes. But just think about it. During our most productive years in American history, the highest tax rate was like 90%. And people just don't believe it, but it's there for everybody to see. And so we were able to pay our bills and we were doing well. Let me just explain one thing about progressive income taxation, which is the basis for the taxation schemes of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and AOC. It goes something like this, okay? There's a doctrine in economics, Michael, that you are aware of called diminishing marginal utility. And the doctrine of diminishing marginal utility basically posits that the more you have of something, the less you miss it. Okay, the more you have of something, the less you miss it. If I'm really hungry, I may want, I'll pay almost anything to get a burger. If I'm at a place and I can't get it for any cheaper, but by the time I get to that second burger, I don't want it quite as much. And by the time it comes down to the third burger, I just, and so diminishing marginal utility we see throughout just human conduct. And it is true. The more you have of something, the less you miss it. That's why we're against typically regressive taxes. Let me give you an example of a regressive tax. It's a sales tax. It's a regressive tax, okay? Because everybody is paying the same rate. But just look at it this way. Let's assume that a sales tax on an item turns out to be $200. Well, for a person who has an income of $100,000, that's taking just 0.2% of that person's income. But what about this person who's struggling, working 2 or 3 jobs and has an income of $10,000? Whether that person is saved up or regardless of what that person has done, that's $200 sales tax is taking a whopping 2% of that person's annual income. And that's why we don't like regressive income taxes. And could the wealthy and the more well-to-do stand to pay some of these higher taxes, like for people who have net worths of $50 million? I hate to tell you this, but they wouldn't even miss it. I mean, it seems unfair and da-da-da-da-da, but really right now, the people in the higher tax brackets are really paying almost all the federal income taxes. I'm just gonna, yeah, you can just read my winners and losers book. And it's not trying to play any devil's advocate or what have you, but if under our progressive income tax system, unless you're President Trump, if you are in the higher income group, you're going to just be paying more taxes, okay? And so the top 1% of earners pays a disproportionately large amount of the total taxes, because when you look at the people in the lower brackets, their incomes don't really result in much, if any, federal income taxes being paid, okay? So there are certain taxes that we all have to pay, okay? We have to pay Social Security and Medicare taxes. A lot of people don't know how we fund Social Security. This is how it works. 6.20% of your gross income that comes out of your check every month if you're working for Social Security, if you're working as an employee for somebody else, okay? Another 1.45% comes out for Medicare. If you add those up, that means 7.65% of your gross income goes to pay for Social Security and Medicare. Now, if you work for somebody, that employer has to match that 7.65%. So the government wants 15.3% of every employee of an employer, wants 15.3% of that person's salary to pay for our Social Security and Medicare system. Now, let me just say, that is not federal income tax. That's the payroll tax, okay? But it's still a tax, okay? And so if you're an employer, you're still paying taxes, even though most people want to focus just on one tax, and that's the federal income tax. And I can understand that. But let me suggest one thing to you. Democrats typically have no problem with raising taxes, and especially taxes on the wealthy. And I don't want you to ever forget, and the audience to ever forget this point, that after World War II, well up until Reagan's years, it was not unusual for the top progressive rate to be 90% or in the high 80s or in the 70% rate, 60% rate. It wasn't until Reagan that we got way down to 28%, okay? The top rate right now probably tops off at about 39%, but that's a far cry from the 90% that we've seen historically. So, Michael, I just want to leave you with this thought. A lot of people could be paying more, okay? I'm paying more taxes than I've ever paid before. The tax cut didn't do me any particular good. But I don't mind paying extra amounts for taxes, because I believe we all have to pay our share for the benefits that we want, not only for ourselves, but for the less fortunate.
Thank you, Professor. And I have a quick, if I can get a quick response. I see someone's asking, how high were income taxes during the Reagan years? Like you alluded to, that 40-year period between World War II and the 1980s, where the top progressives were actually doing very, very well in terms of income taxes.
Yeah, Reagan years were in about 28% top rate. It ended up being a 28% rate, not only for the top tax rate, but also for capital gains rate. So capital gains rates had been much lower, and they are lower now, but that's part of the problem. People want a lot of benefits, but are unwilling to pay for them. I have no problem in paying my fair share. In fact, I feel like I'm paying too much, but I'm not going to complain about it. Even though I guess you could say that I benefit as a business person, at least on the business side, from some of these tax cuts, as an entrepreneur. But certainly, I have no problems with paying a higher tax rate, simply because, okay, everybody has to pay their fair share, and I don't mind paying my fair share. And never forget this whole concept of diminishing marginal utility. That's the whole basis of progressive income taxes. People who have net worths of billions of dollars, these people are not going to miss a little bit of money that they would have otherwise had, because they're having to pay a special tax on their wealth. And people just want to cry and cry about it. They just simply don't miss it. I'll give you one personal example, Michael. Some years I make a lot of money, okay? And at certain times of the year, I make a lot of money, okay? But when that time of the year is gone, I start realizing that I don't have this massive amount of income that I had and was generating during these few months that typically I just have stellar earnings, okay, from my outside sorts of things, right? And so as soon as that income, which I set it aside, save some of it, spend a lot of it, house improvements and the like. When that income is now down and I'm kind of back into the regular scheme of things, I start penny pinching. I start missing that money. And let me tell you, the more money you have, the less you miss it. Okay, writing a check for $20,000 or $30,000 here, no problem if I'm generating a lot of income. But when my income falls during those lean periods of time, you're talking about writing a check for $30,000, $40,000 for no, it's not happening. I'm just trying to pay my monthly bills. Are you kidding me? And so the more money you have, the less you miss it. Okay.
And
Church gets a lot of money. Everybody gets a lot of money. When things go back to normal or things start getting lean, nobody's getting that kind of money anymore because I'm feeling it.
Right.
And so the concept is one of called diminishing marginal utility, which is the basis of progressive income tax. And that's based upon the notion that the more you have, the less you miss it. It is absolutely true.
And I just want to put a plug in specifically as we're talking about tax rates. The Trump tax cut increased the individual, tax rates overall. Specifically, the top rate went from 37% to 39.6%. Corporations also saw their tax levels fall, and their income tax rates decline from 21% to 21% from 35%.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting, just to get back into the political sphere and character of these tax policies. What's interesting is that President Trump is basically arguing for working class and middle class support by making them feel as if they've got a home with him because he's someone who's a successful businessman. He's someone who is out to protect their economic interests. However, we see that in the policies, those who are primarily benefiting are not those who fit the same demographic description of the typical person who would go ahead and throw their support behind President Trump. But I want to shift gears a little bit here. Specifically, a lot of young people are interested in Trump's policy as it relates to HBCU funding. I've heard some friends of mine say, hey, the Democratic Party, and, we've had segments about addressing that. I'm not going to go down that road, but they say the Democratic Party has taken advantage of African-American support. And here you have President Trump. He may not say things that you agree with. He may not say things that rub you the right way, but hey, he actually was responsible when he went into office for actually making it a priority to fund HBCUs. And so we see that in his policies, he seems to be also trying to woo over not just African Americans, young African Americans, a very powerful demographic, in my opinion. They say that, this is of course the Huffington Post, they said that more than $700,000 in payments. They say basically that the HBCU policy under this administration has been one that a lot of critics have also praised as well. I want to get your view. Has this been a substantial benefit for the African American community?
First of all, none of it is true. Trump has done absolutely nothing for HBCUs. What happened was that Congress, which initiated the whole HBCU funding, and it's just not HBCU, it's to other Native Americans and other types of institutions, and African Americans only get out of that $221 million slice. HBCUs are getting just 85 million of that. But you need to understand, Trump had nothing to do with it. Congress allowed for this funding, which has been on the books for years and years and years. Congress allowed it for it to lapse. Okay. And then they said, look, we need to fix this. We need to fix this. And so you got some folks in the Senate who initiated this. Trump didn't initiate not one bit of this. It wasn't like Trump said, let's provide money that never existed before for HBCUs. And first and second, Congress basically the Senate, Lamar Alexander and a few folks said, "Hey, look, this is just not right." And Lamar Alexander had other matters that he wanted to address, and he said, "Let's just address these other matters, which is making the FAFSA form more user friendly." That's what he was really concerned about. And he said, "Let's just add that on, and so maybe we can get this bill back into effect, that we are responsible for allowing it to lapse." The only thing that Trump did was to sign the bill that came to him from Congress. He did nothing. I could see if he initiated it and it was some major policy initiative that he said, I want you guys to enact this. He did nothing. The only thing he did was to say, "Hey, I'll sign it. No problemo." So I could see it if he initiated something that did not exist before. You need to understand that all Trump did was to sign legislation that was initiated in the Senate and then got bipartisan support to restore. Let me say that 3 more times. Restore, restore, restore funding that already existed. It wasn't anything, not a dime of additional money. So Trump did absolutely nothing. He didn't initiate any extra money. So I don't know where this zombie idea comes from, because it's just simply not true. Okay.
And I want to turn our attention to tariffs a little bit. Specifically, as a candidate, President Trump was looking to speak to the forgotten man and woman, as he often said. And part of that agenda included bringing back steelworker jobs. President Trump promised tariffs against China. This was a huge deal for him. And as a businessman, it was part of his political identity that he was going to go ahead and make sure that China is no longer taking advantage of the United States, as he had often alluded to. He said that, there was a specific farmer, Mike Burt. He was an average, everyday person. PBS interviewed him, and NPR, I'm sorry. And he said, in response to Trump's tariffs on China, he said, "It's about time. I've watched the farmers get their subsidies. I've watched the banks bail out. I've watched the automotive industry get their bailout, and I'm just waiting to get my fair share, because I don't want to wither on the vine." Now, the Trump tariffs on the steel imports from China actually resulted in a 25% tax that resulted in the price of American steel rising. Besides the price of steel increasing, how have these tariffs helped or hurt the steel industry in the United States, and what kind of devastating or positive impact have they had?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for this question. Most economists paid very little attention to the trade deficit before Trump ran for office. It just wasn't a big deal. Tariffs, if you don't believe me, tariffs on foreign imports are a tax on Americans. It makes the prices for any of those products go up. Now, Trump insisted that deficits were a sign of weakness. I'm about to hit you with some statistics, Michael. I'm going to hit you with some stats that are going to knock your socks off. Trump insisted that deficits were a sign of weakness. Are you kidding me? Deficits are at all-time high now. He promised his trade deals would get deficits back down. Here we go. Listen to this. What happened instead is that the overall trade deficit in 2018, by 2018, was the largest in a decade. So the overall trade deficit has only increased. And so Trump's trade wars have only made things worse, not better. Okay. And his people close to him were telling him that nobody is going to try and enter into a trade war with America. Well, but basically, the World Trade Organization just ruled against us and in favor of China on some of our policies. All we could do is just fret about that. We were threatening tariffs on Canadian aluminum, and Trump administration said, "Hey, no, they depend upon us too much. They certainly won't retaliate." Trudeau said, "Hey, yeah, you try doing that, and you see what happens. We're gonna make it so expensive for Americans to purchase certain products that we would otherwise be supplying, and so you do it, and we're gonna fight back." And you know what the Trump administration did? This is just like last week. They said, "Forget it." It says we're not going to tax your aluminum, because they never expected these nations to kind of, other than China, to fight back tit for tit. This is for real. And what has Trump's trade wars given us? It's caused Harley Davidson to offshore for the first time its manufacturing because its inputs were too expensive for steel and for other matters. It's just a shame. You know, before we end, I would like to share some stats with you, unless you have some other question that you might want to ask.
I want to ask some more, but go ahead. I'm interested in this. Please go ahead.
In unguarded moments, Michael, with senior aides, President Trump has maintained that Black Americans have mainly themselves to blame in their struggle for equality, hindered more by a lack of initiative than societal impediments, according to former U.S. officials who heard him say this. I just want to give you some stats that show you that you can blame African Americans all you want, but there's something else that's going on, and we call it racism. And you know, until you see these stats, you know, you won't really believe them. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston found in 2018, Michael, listen to this, that although some may blame poor spending habits on the lack of wealth in African American households, the report cites findings that the average white household spends 1.3 times more than the average African American household of the same economic group. And so you hear about all this, these African Americans are just wasting their money. We know that that's not true. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston told us that on average, white people of the same income group are spending 1.3 times more than the average African American household. If that doesn't catch your interest, or you say, is that really? Yes. A white household with less than a high school degree has 1.7 times as much wealth as an African American household with at least some college. Now check this out. A white single parent household has 2.2 times as much wealth as an African American two-parent household. So a white single parent household has 2.2 times as much wealth as an African American two-parent household. Something else is going on here. If that doesn't get your attention, then this will definitely get your attention. A white two-parent household has levels of wealth 10 times higher than that of African Americans and 8.6 times that of Hispanic and Latinos. And if that's not discouraging enough to let you know, in addition to that, 41% of Black businesses simply do not exist anymore as a result of the pandemic. No other demographic has seen such great loss in businesses than the African American community. Everybody else is, except for Latinos, is just like half of that amount. So something systemic is going on, Michael. And then this is the last thing. You hear people saying, well, college education is the pathway. That's the way forward. And I agree with that. But this is a statistic that you're not going to like. According to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank Center for Household Financial Stability, between 1992 and 2016, college-educated white Americans saw their net worth rise by 96%, while the net worth of college-educated Black Americans fell 10%. Something else is going on here. Less than half of African American adults are currently employed. This is not good. And we should be talking about solutions. So nothing that Trump is doing is making any kind of dent. And all these misinformed people who believe that Trump has done something for HBCUs, he has done absolutely nothing. Okay, the only thing that he did was to sign legislation initiated as bipartisan legislation in the legislative branch, okay, which restored funding that had lapsed because of the bickering on Capitol Hill. Restored. So Trump did not do anything to add. All he did was sign off on legislation that he had nothing to do with, that he did not initiate, that simply restored what existed before Congress let it lapse. So Trump has done absolutely nothing for African Americans, and anybody who believes that he has, you're sadly mistaken. And even Bob Johnson, who claims that trickle economics kind of work, it works for him, but it doesn't work for anybody else. Right. It never has. That is the single most refuted idea and concept that has ever existed. It has never worked. There has never been a study that has been done to show that by drastically cutting taxes, that people are going to become super productive, and so that for all the revenues that are being lost, that somehow all these super productive people are going to make it up. Look, Michael, it has never happened, and that is why the Nobel laureate in economics, Paul Krugman, calls trickle-down economics, that is supply-side economics, the ultimate zombie. It's just never, ever proved.
Professor, I want to get your thoughts on, turning back to national political strategies. It seems as if Trump, despite, all the facts that were shared tonight, has convinced the majority of eligible voters that he is the best candidate of the two between him and former Vice President Biden to handle the economy. The Washington Post earlier this month, at the end of August, actually, beginning of September, had reported that senior Biden campaign officials cheered a CNN poll conducted between August 28th and August 1st that had Trump polling 49% on the economy and Biden at 48%. And this was the closest Biden had been this entire election cycle to President Trump on the economy. Now, from between August 12th and August 15th, another CNN poll came out that had Trump at 53% and Biden at 45%. So it seemed as if as quickly as that went up, it went back down. Typically, when we're looking at these national polls, whether it's Quinnipiac, ABC, 538, NBC, CBS polling, they all tend to have the same trend where Trump is ahead. And I know that there's a lot of skepticism behind polls since 2016, but I say I don't put a lot of stock in polls since that election, but I do think that the polls indicate that there is a trend, where there is a trend going on. Right now, it looks like the trend is that most people believe that President Trump is the better candidate on the economy. How do you think he was able to convince so many people about that?
That's a good question. The same way he's convinced people that he's an upright and righteous man, I guess. I think that there's a lot of other things that are going on. This country is marching toward majority-minority status. Some people really do fear that. Racial resentment is at the heart of a lot of things. Look, the reason some farmers who have been hurt most by Trump's policies, a few of them say, well, we will not vote for him again, but others are saying, well, he stands for things that I believe. And what are those things? A a lot of these have to do with some like social issues. Whenever you hear people talking about small government, what they're really saying is that we don't want to take care of Americans. We don't want to see people have health care or housing, let them fend for themselves. A lot of people in their minds, I don't know where this comes from, believes that it's minority populations who are receiving the greatest chunk of welfare, and it's essentially a lot of racial unrest. All these brown people coming across our borders, people feeling like we're losing control of our country. In fact, you just look on television and you see who are the mayors of a lot of these cities. It's a lot of African Americans, and so he'll attack Democrats and who tend to be leaders in major cities. I mean, the mayor of Houston is African. You just kind of go down the line. You have Latinos in control, and so it's sad, but it's true. The thing that's driving a lot of all this is fear, fear of change, and so people feel comfortable when they believe that we're going to have this small government. In fact, there's an article that I shared with you and the rest of our law, economics, and capitalism class, where there was a woman who is very politically active, who said that Democrats may force me to vote for Trump. And she said all this stuff about all this government spending for a clean environment. What's so bad about that? For health care for everybody, she said that scares the bejesus out of her. And what's so bad about that? It's going to happen anyway, because the generation underneath us, they're not going to go down with all this warming climate. These kids, as soon as they get a chance to vote, they're going to be voting for politicians who recognize that there is such a thing as climate change, and that you just look at all these wildfires, you look at all these increased hurricanes, and people don't understand how global warming works, and so we have a whole generation that's coming underneath us. And so there's going to be a lot of change. There's going to be a sea wind of change. But right now, people who have always been used to being in control, it's not an easy thing to confront the idea that in a few years, we're not going to be in control, at least of the levers of politics, and it's nothing to be scared about. What's so scary about universal health care? What's so scary about everybody? In our country, we're the only country where women have to have GoFundMe accounts in order to raise money for their breast cancer treatment. I was supervising a professor on the main campus of Howard University who was up for tenure, and she had done original research that showed the persons who had greater success in raising funds for their breast cancer treatments because their insurance didn't provide for it. I just asked during her presentation for anybody to do a Google search or any kind of search to see whether there was one recorded GoFundMe fundraiser for women in Canada or for any of the European Union countries to pay for their cancer treatments. And guess what? In lifetime, people said they could not find not one person in any of the European Union countries, and definitely not one person in Canada, who had to do a GoFundMe account, raise a fundraiser in order to pay for medical care. And the last thing I want to say about this, because some people think this is just so terrible, I don't see what's so terrible about health care for everybody. We can pay for it. And this is it. There was a young lady who was visiting America, visiting New York City from London. She got sick. She had to go to the hospital. And when she got back to London, she realized, that she was getting all of these extremely high medical bills, and she couldn't figure out what was going on. And because those are just covered, you don't pay anything for that in England. Okay, you don't pay for that in London. And she was shocked. She ended up having to enter into a settlement with the hospital, whereby she would pay 25% of these bills, because she said that she was just shocked. She said that Americans have to pay so much. She says this is just free for us. And so I had to send you guys that article, because here's one person who says that she would vote for Trump because she fears Bernie Sanders, she fears Elizabeth Warren, she fears Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She believes that they're going to bring about the death of America as we know it. She believes that perhaps these three musketeers are going to be able to control Biden, and that this is going to be the end of life as we know it. That's the same thing that people said prior to Social Security. That's the same thing that people said prior to Medicare. The same thing that they said prior to Medicaid. We have not yet gone adrift into the ocean. We are still here, and people now appreciate that we have Social Security, which was more of a New Deal legislation, that we now have Medicare, that we have Medicaid. And if for those of you out there who don't understand this, yes, the government may come up like $1 trillion short in paying its bills, and so it has to borrow money. The federal government doesn't print money to pay its bills. Only the Federal Reserve can print money, and it doesn't print money to pay for the government's bills. I mean, a lot of people just don't understand that. People say, well, they can print money. It doesn't work that way. The United States government has to borrow money, and it borrows money by issuing treasury bills, treasury bonds, treasury notes, and it has auctions every Monday where it's raising billions of dollars in order to pay its debt. But this is something that you also need to understand. You have something that's called the gross federal debt. And then you have debt that the federal government owes to other parts of the government, like the Social Security Trust Fund. The Social Security Trust Fund is very, very healthy. The federal government robs, when I say it robs, it borrows, okay, billions of dollars from the Social Security Trust Fund. And so this becomes money that is owed to other parts of the to the government. And so when we talk about the net public debt, we have to subtract the amount from the gross debt that the government owes to other portions of the other portions of the federal government. Let me be clear. Social Security is strong, and it could be made even stronger. If you don't believe it's strong, why does the government borrow money from the Social Security Trust Fund? Did you ever think about that? Yeah, and we're talking about trillions of dollars that is borrowed. It borrows money from the Medicaid fund. Okay, why does it do it? Because the money's just sitting up there.
And Professor, before you get to, I just wanted to put a plug in, because in chapter 1 of your book, Winners and Losers, you do mention that $3 trillion annually is spent on businesses basically getting tax deductible status. So that is basically, I think you called it the welfare program that goes unnoticed, or something along the lines, where it's a welfare program that a lot of people don't get a lot of attention to, because it's something that, is accepted. It's like an integral part in American capitalist society now.
Well, I benefit from it too. So you benefit from it too. Let me, for people who are like upper middle class people, and even, just kind of halfway middle class, if you're working, you have a job, and your employer is paying for your medical insurance, or for a good portion of it, you don't pay income taxes on the amounts that your employer is paying. Did you know that? That's just excluded from your income. But that is money that is actually being paid for you. And it's a lot. And if the government were to do away with that tax loophole of excluding the amounts of money that your employer and my employer pays for my health insurance, the government treasury would have what, about $1.56 trillion in additional income. It's just amazing. But I benefit from it. And so Donald Trump, since he's in the news, look at this guy. What he paid? What, $750? Now I understand what he's doing, and let me just say this to the audience: there's absolutely nothing wrong with tax avoidance. Tax avoidance just simply means utilizing all the tax loopholes that you have available. Okay, even though with Trump, I'm not sure whether it was just tax avoidance. Now, tax avoidance is legal. Tax evasion is illegal and can get you some jail time. What we don't know is how much of what Trump was doing was tax avoidance and how much of it was tax evasion. Okay. So when you have a lot of depreciation deductions and a lot of other deductions that you typically have when you're a real estate investor, it is not unusual. And I can say this based upon personal experience in some years, for your depreciation deductions to almost offset your entire income from rent. And depreciation is special because you're not writing a check like you do for other expenses. And so the government says you can take this depreciation for wear and tear on your asset. And so I just remember when I was a real estate investor in Houston, Texas, I would have income that was totally offset by my tax deductions, which meant that I was receiving essentially all that rental income tax-free because I reported no income. Now, the tax laws at that time allowed me to carry over excess deductions that I could use in future years. That's what Trump has done. And so this is the reason why, in terms of federal income taxes, he's paid basically nothing. And that's just utilizing the system. But if all of these tax loopholes were done away with, or a lot of them were done away with, this country would have absolutely no problem paying its bills.
Professor, I'm glad you moved on to that, because before we end, I have to, discuss the bombshell report by the New York Times that came out last night, Sunday evening, that included, as you alluded to, that Trump was able to avoid paying income taxes for 10 of the 15 preceding years towards his 2016 election victory. He paid only $750 in income taxes during the first 2 years of his presidency. He was able to also cover his personal tax liability by a $72.9 million refund he received in 2010. And so we're seeing, the results of what it is that he's doing to utilize these tax loopholes to his benefit. He was able to go ahead and pay off his children like Ivanka Trump, Donald Jr., by designating the payment as a write-off. This is something that, a lot of folks are scratching their heads over in terms of looking at whether or not this was ethical. The trove of financial information Trump obtained by the New York Times revealed discrepancies between how much money the president claims to have made versus how much he told the IRS he made. And we know that earlier, and this summer, June specifically, the president actually removed the prosecutor in Manhattan in the Southern District of New York, who was tasked with going into prosecuting against the president's case to open up his tax files. Jeffrey S. Berman, he removed him. And so I want to ask the question, in light of all of these damaging revelations by the New York Times, does it look like, if things don't go according to Trump's plans on November 3rd, that Trump could potentially be looking at jail time after, January 20th, 2021?
Cohen has already said that we know he's an unindicted conspirator, which is a kind of so Michael Cohen is doing jail time for something that Trump instructed him to do. So none of it makes much sense. It's looks more like a criminal organization to me, Michael. I just hate to 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 say it, but yeah, there's some bad things that have happened, and it is what it is, as they say. I have no doubt that if one person can be jailed for something that he was doing on behalf of a person who just happens to be president, that lets you know something right there. And it's because of this Justice Department policy that you can't uh, indict a sitting president. That's just a policy. There's nothing in the Constitution or laws that say that you can't. And so we're left with, the impeachment process, and a lot of people are just saying, "Wow, a lot of people are going to have a lot to deal with in the aftermath of when Trump leaves, whenever he leaves, because they let and allowed all of these things to happen under their watch when they could have stood up." By the way, Mitt Romney is the only person in the history of America from another party to vote to impeach a president of the same party. It's just never happened before. At least the people in your own party supported you. But when you have a person from your own party who believes that you've committed high crimes and misdemeanors, that should tell you something right now. And Mitt Romney is from Utah, which is a very conservative state. I was out there teaching at the flagship university, Mormon school, Brigham Young University, out in Provo, Utah. It's a very conservative state. It's a very red state, and for him to take a stand like that was pretty powerful. So it's I don't want to proclaim people criminals, but Michael Cohen has already done it. He's serving jail time for something that the president instructed him to do. And we can just point to any number of other things that would constitute crimes. In fact, one of my former students, Tish James, who's the Attorney General of New York, God knows what Tish and the New York State Attorney General have. I just think it doesn't look good for the president. But as long as he is president, there are a lot of things that you can get away with because, the buck stops with you. He would not be able to get away with this without Barr. We've never had an attorney general who sees himself as the personal attorney for a president. It's just never happened in the history of our republic.
And, before I move on to the very last question of the evening, I just want to also include that the New York Times bombshell report also revealed that Trump's seems to be in a lot of debt. The Times estimated that Trump owes $421 million in loans he personally guaranteed, in addition to the potential debt he may owe the IRS pending the investigation into his $72.9 million tax rebate. And Trump also owes the entirety of a $100 million mortgage on Trump Tower due in 2022, and at least $155 million in debt Trump listed in his 2020 financial disclosure are due by the end of 2024. So this is a very ongoing developing story. But I want to end off the night by, asking you this question. Despite predictions, that a Trump victory in November 2016 would result in a plunge in the stock market, the S&P 500 as well as the NASDAQ rose 1.1 each on election day 2016. The day after election day. And the Dow plummeted nearly 900 points at one point. And investors expressed fear that there would be no apparent winner in 2016. And above the uncertainties that lie in a potential Trump administration, they had predicted that, they were unsure as to how the markets would play out. What caused the overnight panic to evaporate so quickly, Professor? What caused that panic to evaporate? And I want to also throw in a question as to, do you see the same thing happening if Trump wins somehow again? If Trump wins again, this November. Will the same thing happen with the markets, with the S&P 500, with the Nasdaq, with the Dow? And what kind of potential, impact do you think a Biden victory would have on the markets as well? Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry. You're on mute.
One thing your viewers should know is that the stock market is not the economy. It is. It's not the economy. It's people who are investing based upon what they believe may happen with respect to selected companies in the future. And so the stock market is forward looking. It's not only looking at what's going on now, it is making projections into the future. And I want to say this at least two times. As any economist will tell you, the stock market is not the economy. I'll say that one more time. The stock market is not the economy. The reason why the stock market has not totally crashed, given over 204,000 people dead, with transportation, hospitality, restaurants, retail just going down the tube. The reason why the stock market has held up as well as it has is because the stock market is receiving a lot of support from the Federal Reserve. It's cut interest rates to zero. You've got Congress pumping what started out to be $2.2 trillion into the economy that morphed into $3 trillion. And so all of this cash that has been going into the economy, not just from the government, the federal government, but from the Federal Reserve that has put at least pumped $3 trillion of cash into the economy by buying up the debt, companies that need loans, the lender of last resort because of emergency legislation that allows Fed greater leeway in lending, $3 trillion worth. That's what's keeping the stock market up because interest rates are low. Where else are you going to put your money? You're going to purchase bonds? You're not going to put your money in bonds because interest rates are so low, with one exception. Investors worldwide will always purchase United States government bonds, treasury bills, treasury bonds, treasury notes, simply because it is considered to be the safest investment in the world because it is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. But let's make one thing clear. The stock market is not the economy. The reason why the stock market has done as well as it has during this crisis is because the economy is flush with money, thanks to the Federal Reserve. Banks are not really struggling. Every interest rates are low. That's the reason why the housing market is booming. The housing market is booming because you can get a mortgage for under 2%. I mean, under 3%. I have friends who are looking for to buy new houses simply because interest rates are so cheap. And so if you're one of the fortunate few who've been able to keep your job during all of this, and you're not really missing a beat because you can do like we're doing, you can work online and can communicate through technology. This is a great opportunity for you to start buying up real estate and doing other things simply because we don't know whether we'll ever see interest rates this low. But this is only because of intervention at the macroeconomic level. Fiscal spending by the federal government, massive fiscal spending by the federal government, and even more massive intervention by the Federal Reserve.
Thank you, Professor. James Carville's 1992. Well, first of all, James Carville was a political strategist for President Bill Clinton during his 1992 presidential campaign. His phrase is "the economy stupid" weighs heavy on my mind this election, particularly because we're seeing polling numbers that reflect more like years like 1980 and 1992. And both of those years were the only years since World War II we had an incumbent president fail to secure a second term. Not to say or make any predictions, I'm just saying that it's worth paying attention to. Professor Rogers, thank you so much for your valuable insight on all things the economy this election. It was such an honor to have you on. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I thank you all. Thank you for being courteous enough to join me on Monday night. And I just want to apologize for the mishap that happened Thursday with the technical difficulties. And I thank the viewers for bearing with me as well. I really hope you all enjoyed this discussion. Professor Rogers, I just want to thank you so much again for being a part of this initiative that I've undertaken. We are 36 days out, folks, from the November 3rd, 2020 election. That's just a little over a month. Things are getting really real. And I just hope that, something tonight motivated you to take this election more seriously. Do what you need to do. Fill out that application for an absentee ballot before your state deadline. The stakes are way too high in this election. We talked about the economy. There are many more issues on the table, and all of them are crying out for some real leadership. So I thank you, Professor, for joining me tonight. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end this broadcast of the Political Mic. Stay tuned for episode 12.